sit down for the
yeah, go for
instead
it.
of maybe, I don't know, there's such a gulf between us. So how about if I sit over here? No.
Vacation, but the good
That's actually okay. So today I'm really going to talk to you about an extraordinary variation of an extraordinary event. So burning people alive for heresy in the Middle Ages really was an extraordinary event. It's very, very rare, especially compared to other types of capital punishment, which were infinitely more common than burning people alive. In Western Europe, burning alive, beginning in the 11th century, eventually became the customary punishment for unrepentant heretics. For good or for ill, rightly or unfairly, this customary punishment, rarely enacted, has also colored ideas about the medieval period up to the present day. This dramatic punishment presented an excellent opportunity for the articulation of messages, colored by eschatological expectations regarding the fires of the other world and the final kingdom of God. Sometimes this messaging and the reading of this messaging, the interpreting of it, could become quite complex, like the examples I'm going to talk about today. Today, I would like to interrogate two medieval sources that consider the possibility that specific heretics might indeed appear immune to the flames. Both examples are not miraculous. These are not cases of mistakes on the part of authority divinely revealed, like a successful ordeal or the fiery furnace of Daniel. Rather, these are cases where the devil, or at least his human agents, appear as angels of light. Like the discernment of spirits or the reading of a text, these instances require interpretation for both their causation and also their meaning to be properly understood. Both sources are from the Rhineland, both are Cistercian. The first is a little-known text from the 12th century, an anonymous treatise titled Against the Errors of Alberon, the Priest of Merk. The second is an excerpt from the famous Dialogue on Miracles by Caesarius of Heisterbach, written around the 1220s. These sources imagine the possibility of apparent heretical miracles, and they use this possibility as an opportunity to consider relations between likeness and difference, and how Christians should interpret or read these relationships and interactions to find truth. Part 1. Light rejoices in light. Against the Errors of Alberon, the Priest of Merk, was written between 1160 and 1178. Its target, Alberon or Albero, I like to call him Alberon because it sounds better to me, but I think Albero might be a more solid linguistic rendering, appears to have served as a priest for a parish dependent on the Cistercian monastery of Altenburg near Cologne. And the author may have been a member of that house. In place and time, this text is closely associated with the famous burning of heretics at Cologne in 1163, as well as the first identification of a group of heretics in medieval Western Europe called Cathars by Egbert of Schonau. This neglected text is an excellent resource for attempts to understand exactly who the heretics burned at Cologne actually were, as well as the kinds of dissent that may lie beneath the heretics first described by Egbert as Cathars, the first legal use of that name. Rather than a member of a continent-spanning heretical sect, Alberon appears as an exasperated would-be reformer who finally broke with the institutional church. Like the sources for the burnings at Cologne itself, the accusations against Alberon take place in an atmosphere of deep dissatisfaction with clerical corruption and the Alexandrine Schism, the period when there's two popes, an imperial pope and a Roman pope. In fact, an internal reference to the schism as ongoing allows the dating of the text, one of the ways we can date it. Dissatisfaction with corruption and the immersion of the church in the world suffuse this text as it confronts a central issue. The very desires that lead the heretic into heresy are often the same that draw their orthodox combatants against them. The orthodox reformer who denounces clerical corruption in the desire for purity resembles the supposed heretic who, likewise, seeks a purer church. This treatise is about interactions between likeness and difference, and how each responds to, and in fact helps to create, the other. As described by the author, Alboron's depravity originates from his desire for purity, particularly for a clergy freed from the corruption that he saw all around him. According to the author, Alboron's major heretical teachings all suggested that the moral status of the priest directly impacted the efficacy of the sacraments he offered on behalf of the faithful. The author recognizes the possibility of a ready transference between opposites in the course of his polemic, while sustaining an emphasis on the human responsibility for the maintenance of the divisions between oppositions. This awareness takes the form of a paraphrase from Horace, offered in the course of explaining the nature of Alboron's theological mistakes regarding sinful priests' ability to confect the sacrament. He says, "But because very many, when they flee vices, fall into their opposites, for the fault of fault leads to vice if it lacks skill, it should be examined closely how what we say can be true. The dangers inherent in strident criticism adhere to both the author of the treatise and to its target, Alboron. The writer realizes that his refutation of Alboron could very easily slip into a defense of criminal priests. Likewise, Alboron's readiness to find fault with the institutional clergy has itself led to a grave moral failing in the form of his desertion of the church that is the sole vehicle for human salvation." The author tells how Alboron, in order to prove the truth of his teaching and to demonstrate his sanctity against his corrupt opponents, has to be tested through the ordeal of fire. In the opinion of the writer of the treatise, Alboron's request, in fact, sprung from his inner disposition in the form of an attraction between similarities enabled by an earlier transference between opposites. He says, "Because it is written that like rejoices in like, just as he was badly aflame inwardly, he sought the flames outwardly, asking to be tested through fire, so that the truth of his defense could become known to all. Alboron the heretic sought his natural complement, and this complement is fire. But this relationship with flame is complex and potentially misleading to observers. It needs interpretation. His very heretical nature that seeks out fire as like is drawn to like may affect the natural virtue of the flame. As the author explains, if Alboron had undergone the ordeal and passed through the fire without burning, this would have been due not to his holiness, but in fact to demonic power. Some kind of sorcery, maleficium, could cause the element of fire to let go of its own power. Alboron's request for the ordeal is denied for this reason, and for the fear that the ordeal in general is a form of testing God. This very sentiment is itself a symptom of the Orthodox reform, which sought to diminish clerical involvement in the judicial ordeal in the course of the 12th century. And the author cites a letter of Gregory the Great criticizing the ordeal found in the Decretum. In his refusal of the ordeal and the demonization of those who seek it as a sign of legitimacy, an Orthodox reformer here asserts his identity against the backdrop of the illicit reformer. The Aristotelian adage, like rejoices in like, describes more, I think, than Alboron's heretical nature. It reflects upon the Cistercian author and his engagement with heresy, because the basic motive that drives both men, as the treatise develops, is clearly the same. After the author refutes the heretic's various opinions, he shifts the target of his treatise to the corrupt churchmen that generated the heretic, in a way becoming the redeemed likeness of the heretical parish priest that he has just textually destroyed. Like has again been drawn to like, as the author's desire for reform takes the place of Alboron's own similar desire. The author chides the wicked priests that they should not smile at Alboron's defeat, as his banishment does not equate to an endorsement of their sins. In fact, by far it is the opposite. In their wickedness, he says, they will be with Alboron in hell. In damnation, they're all going to be the same. Reflecting on the origin of heresy, the author explains, and this is a really amazing quote that should be more known. Lovers of virtue, zealotores, have made themselves heretics when they compare the sanctity of the sacrament and the perversity of those carrying it out, thinking that such an opposition in the same thing at the same time ought not to be, nor can be. The author of this treatise identifies the origin of heresy with the reforming zeal of his time, and the opposition it poses to the failings of the established clergy. This very zeal that creates heretics is very much like the zeal that leads to the refutation and destruction of heretics. They are so different, and they are somehow the same. Both the Cistercian and the heretic he attacks are zealotores. In this treatise, a complex set of interactions between similarity and opposition has developed. At the heart of these interactions lies the delicate balancing on the part of an interpreter. As the interpreter who must resolve recurrent ambiguities and contradictions. At different points, Alboran has been described as very similar to demons elsewhere in the treatise, the fires of judgment, the wicked priests he despises, and the very author of the treatise. His evil and his error originate from his good, and what is worst in him not only comes from the desire for what is best, but it recurrently appears as identical to it. Similarity coexists here with difference in the process of self-definition and self-fashioning. The recognition of this difference, within a moment of attraction between apparent similarities, allows the eventual banishment of this very difference once recognized, while enabling the realization of the true shape and the mission of the self as an Orthodox Christian. This mission must exist within the logic of binary communities. There are only two human societies, if we are thinking purely logically within the world of the text: the church and the devil. These communities, while separate in their fundamental natures and their final destinies, are in the present almost inextricably mixed. The task of the Orthodox lover of virtue is to manage the acts of reading and interpretation, the recognition of the weeds from the grain that allow effective negotiation between them, and eventual secure admittance to the society of God. In short, the ability to see that such oppositions ought not to be, but are. Part 2. Reading under the skin. Caesarius Castobar, another Cistercian in the Rhineland, tells the story of a group of heretics who actually did, if only for a while, defy the flames. They did so in just the way the author of the treatise against Alboran suggested, calling upon demonic power or maleficium. Like Alboran, the presence of this power must be read from the inside out, as outwardly it appears the same as a miracle. This likeness comes about through a contractual interaction between humans and the devil. This contract or pact, or agreement, is initially difficult to see, but becomes apparent through a series of interactions between extremes. Caesarius recalls that about the same time as the burnings at Cologne in 1163, two supposedly holy men came to Besançon. They lived lives of the greatest apparent sanctity, and having caught the attention of the laity, began to preach unheard of heresies. To prove the truth of their novel doctrines, they seemed to work miracles. The two men walked on flour without leaving footsteps, strode over water without sinking, and had wooden huts burned down around them. These flames could not harm them, and as these wonders continued to sway the people, the bishop felt compelled to consult expert advice. The advice that the bishop sought against these heretics was from the very demons who provided their power. The bishop orders a clerk, skilled in the art of necromancy, what a useful hire, to summon the devil and ask him by what power these great and stupendous miracles are being wrought. The bishop knows that these are not true miracles by the content of the heretic's preaching. In this sense, he already knows what power is behind their wonders. This foreknowledge of what the heretics are guides the bishop's own process of interpretation and his actions. When the clerk objects that he had long ago given up the sinful practice of necromancy, the bishop responds that without definite answers, the people will surely kill him. If the clerk obediently summons the devil, this act will be an expiation for his past sins, rather than a new one. This is a form of penance. False miracles here cause recourse to a forbidden art in the service of God. Like is joined with like in the service of his opposite. Indeed, the truth of this opposition, God and his church versus the devil, is demonstrated through the pairing. Once summoned, the devil informs the clerk that the two men are his vassals and that they preach what he has put in their mouths. They cannot be injured because the contracts by which they became his vassals have been sewn under their armpits just beneath the skin. If these texts were ever taken from them, their powers would leave them, and they would become weak like other men. The heretics' written contracts of vassalage recall the legend of Theophilus, translated into Latin in the 8th century. This legend is the origin in the Christian West, one of them perhaps, of the pact with the devil that would become synonymous with later witchcraft. Theophilus sold his soul to the devil through a written contract, and this story would later inspire a set of legends surrounding Gerbert, who became Pope Sylvester II, and the more famous Faust legend. These contracts are described as chirographs or chirographs, however you want to say it, and this specific form, paired with their literal insertion into the heretics' bodies, creates a powerful connection between the heretics and the demonic. A chirograph is a particular type of written contract that is split into parts along a curving line. Only by bringing two or more portions together, and traditionally there are three, can one part be validated as an original copy because they line up. By implication, the other part of the contract, or at least one of the parts of the contract, is in the hands of the devil, actually in hell. These texts are direct connections with the demonic. The insertion of these texts under the heretic's skin is a parallel to the power of the devil that works within them, to such an extent that they are almost puppets, speaking the devil's words and working his false wonders. The removal of these contracts equates to the unmasking of the demonic power at the heart of a heretic, dissolving the apparent likeness between false wonder and miracle, or saint and heretic. The heretics are like the allegorical integumenta, veils or involucra, wrappings, of classical pagan authors, when read in a Christian way, under which these authors chose to hide moral and scientific truths. Pagan tales of apparent immorality, as read by medieval Christian interpreters, had to be taken to mean things other than the literal reading of the words would suggest. It can't be what it looks like. In this fashion, the literal level is never an appropriate meaning, and halting the act of interpretation there is actively harmful. These stories must be interpreted to make the invisible meanings held inside them visible. The heretics, likewise, must have their hidden meaning drawn out of them. This meaning is an actual hidden text from inside their bodies, and this meaning exists as an antecedent to them. The retrieval of this text from the heretical body that encases it is a recovery of this anterior meaning. Filled with the devil's writing, the heretics in this story are really containers for the contained. And just as in the case of pagan allegory, the act of interpretation that follows the recognition of this text is itself an act of placing a veil over the visibilia, or the visible meanings of the text. The surface meaning of the pagan allegory is submerged within its moralized meaning, and the heretic here, as human individual, is destroyed by his unmasking. In his destruction, he dissolves into the fires of the devil that existed before his individual life, that, as in the case of Alberon, are somehow already inside him. The clerk necromancer informs the bishop of the heretic's vulnerability, and the bishop forms a plan that will ensure their destruction. He proclaims to the people that he will follow the heretic's teachings if they work one of their miracles before him. And of course, he chooses the fire miracle. He has a large fire prepared in the middle of town, and before the heretics enter it, the bishop springs his trap, asking to examine their persons for charms, maleficia. The bishop's men discover small scars under their arms. With the help of knives, the contracts are drawn out of them. The heretics, now overwhelmed with panic, no longer wish to enter the flames, as the jig is up. At which point the bishop exhibits the chirographs to the crowd. Enraged, the people hurled the servants of the devil into the fire prepared for them, as Caesarius says that they might go to be tormented with the devil in fire eternal. Caesarius concludes the story by remarking that the bishop's swift action completely extinguished this particular heresy. So throwing the heretics into a literal fire destroys the metaphorical fire of heresy. Caesarius' story of the heretics at Besançon is a model for a hermeneutical process guided by authority. This authority can direct its subordinate members in the literal piercing of misleading appearances. The bishop's servants, under his direction, cut open the heretic's skin with knives. This visceral pulling back of the veil completes the hermeneutic circle at the heart of the reader's awareness of this episode. The two condemned men are signs for something else. The heretics and their apparent wonders must be rendered into a form within a process on the way to its completion. The shape of this process is clear because of the application of a foreknowledge that places the piece in a back-and-forth dialectic with the whole. Appropriate to a setting riven by a desire for reform and a concern for the maintenance of a hierarchically organized community, this dialectic can only be achieved through the guidance of a legitimate authority. Conclusion. These two stories have shown us a remarkable set of interactions, and indeed transferences, between opposites. Similarity has become difference, and apparent differences give way to essential similarities. In these shifting exchanges between orthodoxy and its opposite, likeness and difference generate each other and depend on each other. But what beyond the instability of categories is going on here? I think an answer to this question lies in a consideration of the problems of reading and what guides the process of Christian reading as it's outlined here. The power of the devil, just as the existence of the heretic, comes into being as a result of a successful process of interpretation, at least narratively. Outside of this process, and the divine assistance that enables it, the diabolical is in no way distinguished from the divine, to which it remains recurrently similar and alike. It's no coincidence that these stories have placed such an emphasis on literal conjurations. These formulae encapsulate the intentions, the guiding desires, that create the very categories that they seek. While apparent similarities and differences proliferate, the orthodox identity is refined and through an enduring and building, growing as it goes, similarity of intention, and perfected through difficult comparisons with its opposite, almost like gold tried in a furnace. The Cistercian sources examined above all combine likeness and difference in a search for meaning. The discovery of this meaning, as well as its creation, is enabled through the orientation of love. The existence of a bad love, a thing that generates as well as fixates upon appearances at the expense of spiritual meanings, is essential to the recognition and articulation of a good love that spins true meaning out of itself. The role of the heretic is to embody the misleading and entrapping love, an excess that is also an absence, to become a symbol of it to be read. In reading this symbol, the Orthodox can see themselves as a fulfillment that the heretic lacks. In this process of interpretation, the resemblance between Orthodox and heretic, divine and demonic, is essential, as each depends on the other. Thank you.
Thank you.